Thank you, Srinod, for that introduction. I was very touched that you mentioned feminist mentoring, the piece I wrote, which I think is absolutely not known and it just got lost somewhere. And if anyone is reading it and if you have feedback, I'd be really happy. I had committed to Shinod, and I'm increasingly thinking, Shinod, I have 45 minutes. You said 30 to 45 minutes. So I'll keep to it. So every time I'm thinking, well, I have committed to something and I must deliver, but I get this immense anxiety that I haven't done enough work. So I will begin with an apology from a great person, which will save my skin. So this presentation, like a lot of people say, is a work of progress. It's really a work of progress, work in progress. And I've been thinking about it for a bit. So I want to kind of dignify it by saying it's a partial perspective and borrowing Donna Haraway's word. And some of my students from science and technology studies are here. They will remember this. And to cite her, she said, feminist objectivity is about limited location and situated knowledge, not about transcendence and splitting of subject and object. It allows us to become answerable for what we learn, how to see. So in that sense, it is a partial perspective, more of a reflective note, and just hope that some of it makes sense to you, relates. And it is also partially, since I am saying that knowledge need not exclude emotion, need not exclude, in fact, it's not in exclusion of feeling, emotion, etc., etc. It's partly also my own anxiety and angst at this moment in the Center for Women's Studies, in a growingly neoliberal academia, and how to steer myself within that. Even as the public university retains, thankfully, so far, a semblance of knowledge being a democratic and shared process, open to questioning and revision. It is on this cusp that I must articulate some of my thoughts, whatever they are worth. The idea, simply put, is that there is a gender that everyone knows. Like I've said, and it's part of the abstract, that, it is pretty much common sense, everybody knows. And each one of us thinks that we are capable of generating knowledge about it. And we can also militate on behalf of the gender issue, and increasingly, as they put it, the woman issue or women issue. And then there are subjugated knowledges of gender, which are local, contextual, and disqualified, if you like, that keep cropping up. And some of you will remember that I'm borrowing a lot these terms from Foucault, power knowledge, disqualified, local, etc., etc. So let me begin with feminism's engagement with systems of knowledge, the paraphernalia, the procedures, the distribution of spaces and resources, in short, the conditions of knowledge. Its continuous questioning of the God trick, much before Donna Haraway named it as such, that is the ability to see everything from nowhere. An ability that Haraway says is now 100-fold enhanced by technology. But I'm not talking so much about Donna Haraway. I'm saying what preceded, the legacy. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, we borrow from these legacies. So I recall Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. An academically unseemly anger she voices at the New York University Institute for the Humanities. A text that moves us each day to question universalism and hierarchies of knowledge. And even those knowledges, dominant forms of knowledge that question patriarchy. She says that these very knowledges are also premised on that patriarchy. So just to cite a couple of lines from her, to read this program, because she is presenting in a seminar like this, to read this program is to assume that lesbian and black women have nothing to say about existentialism, the erotic, women's culture and silence, developing feminist theory, or heterosexuality and power. And what does it mean in personal and political terms when even the two black women who did present here were literally found at the last hour? This is the question that she poses to those who invited her. In this paper, I re-invoke such questions at a historical moment when there is an urgency to act, to build what is increasingly being known as the capacity of women, capacity building exercises. Of those women less fortunate, such that they're able to act for themselves, such that they become agents and actors in their own right. So in this paper, I hope to turn to other not so official histories of doing and knowing. So feminists, and I'm not using it in a more for the ease of use, but it's not it's not talking about all feminists all over the world, especially feminists from subjugated locations, have questioned hegemonic knowledges and ways of knowing. In every field, in feminist science studies, film studies, and literature, they brought in the question of the seeing eye, the systems of power it is embedded in, as against the view from nowhere. And that's what Donna Haraway was talking about when she referred to partial perspective. I don't have the scope here to map this complex body of debate, and it's far beyond me also. But you might remember John Berger's ways of seeing, and its very artlessly evocative first line, quote, "Seeing comes before words. The child looks and recognizes before it can speak." Feminist visual theorists have foregrounded male gaze. Bell hooks and many others from more subaltern locations have spoken of the oppositional gaze. They have relentlessly tied cognition and recognition of an object as X or Y or Z to context and the position of the viewer in a system of meanings. So these critiques have challenged, first and foremost, the privileging of pure observation. And this is something that I too came to rather late in sciences, but also in social sciences and in dominant knowledge structures. What, after all, is pure? Let us see. I'll begin with the sciences because the epistemological status of science is tied to observational transcendence and value neutrality, and also because recently I offered a course. So that's there in my head. So I'll just start with that. To cite just a few of Sandra Harding's questions, which have been deepened in various domains by bringing in questions of caste, race, sexuality, and so on. But I just cite her questions. Who can be the subjects, agents of socially, and if I might add here, scientifically legitimate knowledge? What is the nature of objectivity? Does it require a point of viewlessness? What is the relationship between the researcher and her or his research subjects? So these are some of the questions, series of questions that she's posed in her work. As we can see, the gaze is turned back in these questions and in many related debates, turned back on the knower and the frameworks and networks of interests in which knowledge is embedded. What then happens to the idea of the value neutral, disinterested observer? Science has retained its ideological and epistemological purity, as Hilary Rose has pointed out, leaving by implication many times its partner technology to carry the responsibility for the dirty side of the relationship, be it forceful maintenance of the gender order, the gender binary, or the violence on women's bodies, or the depredation of the environment. Another way to look at it is, and a lot of people cite it, that while a few bad scientists might bring their personal bias into the laboratory and research, the scientific process, when conducted in the true spirit, is impartial and puts every premise to rigorous, empirical, and evidence-based test. So again, I'll do a detour through Stephen Jay Gould's very popular essay, Women's Brains, very popular science writer. Some of you might be familiar with his work. And actually, what he points out is that, and talks about a moment which is about a century after Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her very brilliantly argued A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was in 1792, if I recall right, where she contested the inherent intellectual inferiority of women. And a lot of other women novelists, writers have, argued along the same line, contesting the biological inherent inferiority of women. So almost a century after that is, she writes in 1792, and this is in 1872, the leaders of European anthropometry, or measurement of the human body, which today it causes some, embarrassment. Many will call it pseudoscience, and no scientist would want to be associated with. But it's also a history of science. It's a history of knowledge. But at that point of time, it dominated the human sciences for much of the 19th century and remained popular until intelligence testing, or the new avatar of IQ, replaced skull measurement as a favored device for establishing the superiority or inferiority of certain races and genders. Now, when we go to the hospital for any kind of issue, we are forgetting, or we're not able to remember, or there is some intellectual problem with us then, or cognitive disability. So nobody's going to measure our skulls. So craniometry, or measurement of the skull, commanded the most attention and respect at this point of time. Its leader, Paul Broca, and I have no idea as to why we are not taught these histories of science at school, because they're so interesting. Its leader, Paul Broca, 1824 to 80, and the date is important, professor of clinical surgery at no less than the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, and his disciples won high esteem as the jewel of 19th century science. So I think I'll refer to Gould to kind of help us step out of this kind of bad scientist versus good scientist, or bad science versus good science, and draw attention to deeper connections. So Gould writes, had Broca not measured with the most scrupulous care and accuracy the skulls that he measured, Broca depicted himself as an apostle of objectivity, a man who bowed before facts and cast aside superstition and sentimentality. He declared that there is no faith, however respectable, no interest, however legitimate, which must not accommodate itself to the progress of human knowledge and bend before truth. Women, like it or not, had smaller brains than men, and therefore could not equal them in intelligence. This fact, Broca argued, may reinforce a common prejudice in male society, but it is also the scientific truth. It might hurt, but this is the truth. This is what he said, and I have read elsewhere that his instruments were immaculate, they're perfect, and he, in every way, his laboratory or his research was rigorous. Broca's arguments rested upon two sets of data: the larger brains of men in modern societies and a supposed increase in male superiority through time. His most extensive data came from autopsies performed personally in Parisian hospitals. 292 male, the number was 292 male brains and 140 female brains. And the male brains weighed more by a certain percentage. I don't recollect, around 14% or something like that. Broca understood, of course, that part of this difference could be attributed to the greater height of males. I mean, he was a trained scientist and he believed in objectivity. So he understood that. Yet he actually stated that since some of such factors could not be of consequence or something of this side, because see, a priori it is known that even if you take into account that the height of all the corpses were different, that he examined, but one thing which will balance that out, that a priori it is established that women are inferior intellectually. Okay? So mark this. It was a premise that data was supposed to test, not rest upon. So it can be a premise, but the data was supposed to test it. Also not considered was whether it was death by accident. How did the person die? If you're weighing the brain, how did the person die? If it is by accident, then the brain is supposed to weigh more. If it is through a long degenerative disease, then it would weigh less. And Broca would have definitely known about all of these things, much more than I do, or some of us do. Now, this is just a backdrop. There are many, many such examples and narratives that crop up in feminist science studies, for example. But I can just give one example. What feminist science scholars repeatedly point out is the continued adherence to gendered views of phenomena, even as new facts and realities emerge. The question then is, if science is based on objectivity and observation, and we have no quarrels with that, would its premises be not discarded when refuted by new evidence? So this is a question that's interesting and it keeps coming. I'd like to respond to this through another illustrative example, which again a lot of you would be familiar with. It's a very well-known piece. It's called Sexing the X by Sarah H. Richardson. And Sarah Richardson discusses how while both male and female possess an X chromosome, the X is frequently typed as the female chromosome. It is well established today that the Y carries an important genetic switch for male determination. Don't ask me how it does, because the nitty-gritties of it, I'm not a biologist. But in contrast, female sexual development is directed by hormones acting in concert with genes carried by many chromosomes and not localized in X. So these are not localized in X, these factors or these switches. In fact, the X is more important to male biology, considering the number of X-linked diseases men are exposed to. Yet, scientific as well as popular literature, both of them, not just popular fiction, popular literature, but scientific literature as well, continue with the gendering of the X and the Y. X takes on the feminine pronoun, X is referred to as the she, and is frequently associated with the mysteriousness and variability of women. And it's actually funny because as new facts are coming up, this is actually adding to the mysteriousness of X. Because see, it's changing. The way women are, they change and there is something mysterious about it. So it's actually consolidating that kind of an opinion. And I'm particularly struck by the MIT geneticist David Page's poetic description. The language, I think, is pretty much poetic. So he said, I quote, "The Y married up, the X married down. The Y wants to maintain himself but does not know how. He is falling apart, like the guy who can't manage to get a doctor's appointment or can't clean up the house or apartment unless his wife does it." Okay. So, and this again leads me to another set of questions. Okay. Why do feminist scholars, including but not limited to feminist scientists, and in general talking about feminist science scholars, find it important to question scientific truth, T with capital T, truth with capital T, as not outside social and political structures? Why do they need to contaminate the truth, so to speak, and all the time they keep bringing back? So one scientist, I think she's a physicist, Sharath would know better. So Abhasur, I really like her work. And she has very painstakingly retrieved the biographies of 3 women scientists in C.V. Raman's laboratory. Now, even all of us, irrespective of whether we went into science in college or not, we all had science in school, and we are all familiar with C.V. Raman, whether we are familiar with anything else or not. But I did not know these 3 women scientists. So that's why I'm calling it's a retrieval. So these 3 women scientists were Annamani, Sunandabai, and Lalita Chandrasekhar. She does not do so to acknowledge their presence in the hallowed corridors of science by way of tokenism, but to bring out how these women negotiated a masculinized domain in order to pursue the passion for scientific inquiry. Their specific trajectories, of which it's very little is known about, maybe Annamani a little more, but their specific trajectories in terms of career choices, marriage or lack thereof, academic recognition or lack thereof, even death. Sunandabai actually committed suicide. Cannot be understood as separate from the structures of scientific knowledge that they inhabited. How does feminist science studies, maybe I'm not going into it, but if anyone is keen, then in the discussion it could come up. So how does feminist science studies, or as some would put it, gender and science, the domain is characterized by various nomenclature, one being feminist science studies, which I personally prefer. Gender and science becomes like adding gender to science, but anyways. How do they think beyond model systems? Borrowing Mary Pouvet's term, it may be described as a border case. A border case is that which breaks down, ideological certainties, straddles multiple borders of different disciplines. In fact, it calls into question the border of all these disciplines. It also makes visible the impact of science on women's lives, individual and collective. And as we are increasingly asked to adopt multidisciplinarity today, and I can just imagine where my own discipline will go, uh, and everybody wants women's studies or gender studies. I don't know whether that's flattering or that's something that one should be, scared of. But multidisciplinarity is the flavor of the moment. But as there is this favored model of knowledge dissemination, the NEP, I think somebody cited it some 70 times, but something like that. But it would be useful to remember that, if we take the paradigm of feminist science studies, the methodology of science and technology studies, feminist, or wherever the critique of science and technology has emerged, it's not like two disciplines sit comfortably together, as one might, and one suspects whether that happens when we so easily say multidisciplinarity. There are hierarchies and tensions. So that is something one must keep in mind. But one of the heartening things about feminist science studies I learned is that it borrows tools and alternative ways of seeing from social sciences and literature. So, for instance, one would find repeated references to Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought, sociologist, I think, Shashi, if I'm right. So, and how, where she brings out how the academia and privileges structure work such that they hierarchize knowledge. So there's a hierarchy of knowledge. And there is an invalidation of more community-centered knowledges based on personal histories and experiences of Black women. So she speaks of the emphasis on wisdom, which is sometimes called as mother wit. In African American women's feminist discourse, you'll find various ways of referring to wisdom, mother wit, and so on, which is set up against book knowledge. Now, one easy way to look at it is give up scholarship. And as a lot of us are nowadays invited, what are you doing after all? Reading a book, go to the field, And for me, I don't know what the field is. I don't know where to go. It takes a lot of thinking. So it's not like Patricia Williams is saying that book knowledge is something that one must give up. Scholarship is of no importance at all. But she's talking about a certain kind of book knowledge which does not account for different experiences, histories, especially the ones from subjugated locations. So to quote her, she says, knowledge without wisdom is adequate for the powerful, but wisdom is essential for the survival of the subordinate, unquote. Feminist ethnography, and I'm shifting a bit now to feminist ethnography, because one of its tools is also observation. But we have to think what kind of observation, So feminist ethnography, evolving its conceptual and interpretative frames from such alternative standpoints, such as Patricia Hill Collins's, attempts to center the voices and narratives, testimonials, some call it, of women, but these women are not objects, but active participants in recovery of subjugated knowledges. So to take one familiar example, in the medicalized discourse on birth control, for example, women are viewed as instruments of reproduction who have to be managed, educated if necessary. In governance feminism, more inclined towards the neoliberal discourse, these women largely emerge as oppressed by patriarchy. And as we increasingly see, nationalist discourses, where the burden is on a certain community, that you produce more children and so on. So there are very many politics that in which this knowledge is implicated. So on the one side is the first world science of population control and its underlying discourse of eugenics, which has been discussed and pointed out by many, and its collusion with the state and pharmaceutical industries. And on the other side are the voices and experiences of women from the third world, left with unmonitored devices, hormones in their bodies. How do they deal with it? That is another kind of experience or knowledge, which does not come into the dominant discourse of population control. Notwithstanding the enormous and rich body of feminist critiques of objectivity and certainty, the critique which is directed at science, technology, and many such hallowed domains, and dominant disciplinary domains, dominant ways of thinking, I believe that the social sciences and humanities in the current moment are pushed to mimic the natural and physical sciences in terms of producing time and objective bound projects and neat results. And this I feel much more from my own disciplinary location, where, very often one is given to think that the field is a given. You just have to go and extract the knowledge and see what can be done. What one notices is a deep discomfort with theory, not the kind that Patricia Hill Collins and many other subaltern feminists have expressed, that, like what I was saying about book knowledge, and it was not dismissal of scholarship, but it was something else. So the deep distrust of theory that one faces today is not coming from that location, but in favor of doing and action, that you have to act. There is a very real concern also. What kind of knowledge will get jobs and economic security for our students? And I acknowledge that this is a real concern, but I don't know how one might do it. One has to keep thinking about it. So against this backdrop, there is pressure. Is it time? How much more time do I have? I won't take that much. That there must be a direct translation, that you should be able to translate knowledge into skill. And we are witnessing several new terminology like knowledge economy, for example, that it should lead to some tangible impact in terms of what is the economic output, what is the job security, and so on. And in fact, some even strongly propose that a master's syllabus should be designed keeping in mind the requirements of UGC NET. So this kind of a perspective does not really allow for much meandering, and the way we are sitting here right now and you are listening to me, whatever nonsense I am talking, you are probably in this kind of setup and know what I am saying, and I have taken this opportunity because I probably, it will be a useless kind of presentation. But now that I have the chance, and you can see I'm meandering, and I do meander a lot, and somebody told me, why do you think? And in some interview somebody said, she's thinking too much. How can she not be sure? And I'm like, yes, what she said is right, because, as one thought comes, there is another thought, there's another thought. And so there is a kind of, I feel, a resistance to thinking, uncertainty, etc., etc. Notwithstanding all that I talked about earlier and the debates, which are so rich and productive, and because of which today we have some real gains, in terms of disrupting the gender order. Like Hill Collins says, if the scholarly community strays too far from widely held beliefs about Black womanhood, and here I might just remove Black in our context, from widely held beliefs of womanhood, they run the risk of being discredited. So, no, you have to say certain things about women, about women. If you stray too much, then probably it's not such a great thing. Now, to give you an example, again, I'm taking from Black feminism because they discuss so much about single motherhood. And for the longest time, I brought up a child on my own, So somewhere I relate to that. And I have something to say. And it's been empowering to think about this particular thing. So we may actually, if we take up a study, as they call it, study on single mothers in Hyderabad or in India or wherever, you define a geographic location and you mark some people as respondents and so on. You might produce some results or some knowledge about single mothers, what they face, how they behave, how they bring up their children, and so on and so on. To think that some single mothers might not really fit into the study is too much procrastination. Not too much of deferring it, too much of hair splitting, etc., etc. Once again, Black feminists have pointed to the differences between how Black women interpret their experiences as single mothers and how prevailing social science research analyzes the same reality. And here again, the perspective comes in. Whereas the former stress their struggles with job discrimination, inadequate child support, inferior housing, and street violence. And by doing so, many other important factors come in: the state, the race, unequal distribution of resources, all of these. So the single woman is not the only actor in this whole debate and discourse about single mothering. But far too much social science remains mesmerized by, and this is in the US, of course, but we can kind of, I'm just pointing to a way of generating knowledge. Far too much of social science remains mesmerized by images of lazy welfare queens who are content to stay on the dole. But let me return to a question that I sort of left it halfway, because I felt this example would, help me, open this out a bit. The single mother. So I'll return to how active theorization or questioning of given knowledge is being kind of pushed to the margins, as if it's a bad thing, Not even as a bad thing, that's a colloquial way of putting it, as if somewhere it is going to interfere with doing an action. And it is for you to decide. I'm not going to say anything here. I'm not going to force my opinion here as to whether there is such a neat binary between knowledge and doing, knowledge and action. Theory has in fact shifted to the elite private universities on which I have to do a study. This is like, the grapevine. Your friends have their children and you hear here a little bit, there a little bit. But of course, people have also begun to write about it. For example, Chandra Talpade Mahanti. And so somebody could actually look at the syllabi of private universities, for example, what kind of courses they have. And some come and tell me, oh my God, we should have a course like this in women's studies. My thing is, who will teach? How many faculty are there? And who is trained to teach this? Anyways, those are the paraphernalia, the distribution of resources, etc., etc. I'm not going there. You know very well about it. So theory has shifted to the elite private universities where the students can afford to spend time on radical texts and yet not get pushed into the messy politics of real world. Like the Azadi kind, you don't get pushed into a career is destroyed and everything else. But also get a career of their choice here or abroad. So this is where I will cite Chandra Mahanti, who says, I quote, radical knowledges are domesticated by the neoliberal restructuring of higher education. Neoliberal intellectual culture may well constitute a threshold of disappearance of feminist, anti-racist thought, radical theory becoming a commodity to be consumed, not the result of historical struggles and activist scholarship. So again, the duality between theory and, doing and so on and so on. Now, let me move from, because after all, Mahanti is located in the US, and I would like to look at state-funded academia in our own context here and now, where I feel that certain tropes of gender re-emerge very aggressively, rehomogenizing a concept that was rendered relational and contingent through anti-caste and anti-race discourses, among very many other subaltern discourses, So gender was something which one can only address, approach, understand in a set of relations, But like I said, there's an impatience of this unstable quality of gender. Because how do you work on behalf of something which is so unstable? So, some examples. For example, the girl child, the trafficked woman, the single woman, as I said before. So these are tropes of this discourse, and they're givens. Now, you can't say that not all women are trafficked. Those who you consider as trafficked, there is a complex network of migration, work patterns, poverty, against distribution of resources, geographic location, and a lot of work has been done on that. Not by me, but by very many social scientists. I can only name Swati Shah, Prabha Kotishwaran. Rich body of work. And yet we keep coming back to the figure of the trafficked woman. And since it is so overused, it is evacuated of meaning. That is, there is nothing new you can say about it. But it is a favorite trope in gender studies. Several scholars have indicated how the state relies on non-governmental organizations for a theory of gender minus a feminist critique of power relations. Gender mainstreaming and empowerment emerge as key modes of the developmental discourse without situating gender in local and global power relations. Like Malati D. Alvis, Sri Lankan anthropologist, unfortunately passed away recently, puts it, gender is treated, and she's talking about the Sri Lankan question, the conflict and all of that. So she says that gender is treated as a portable tool of analysis and empowerment that can be carried around by international humanitarian and development staff. Conceived, conceived often on narrow economic terms, empowerment becomes a project of development knowledge since the 90s, with little attention to context, culture, and social relations. And I just remember as I was writing this and thinking about it, I was like, 94 or something, the very essay which is so important and retains its importance through all these years. Tejaswini Niranjana and Suji Tharu's A Contemporary Theory of Gender, which they wrote, I think, in 1994, and it was in that post pre and anti-Mandal agitation, post Babri Masjid demolition, and so on. And I was a PhD student then. And I remember the first line, for some reason it is stuck in my head. Suddenly women are everywhere. And I never really realized what it meant. You ignore the first lines. But somewhere I felt that it was signaling to a time and a future. So where feminists once highlighted the systematic institutional bias against women in economic policy, we now see institutions like the World Bank and the Department of International Development lauding the importance of giving women more of a role in economic development. So there is a stress on smart economics with women as actors and so on and so forth. So the scene has shifted. Women are no longer on the sidelines or ignored. And yet, when we take a closer look at the way in which women have come to be represented, it becomes evident that that it is pretty much far from what feminists had imagined or had desired, So some say that gender has come to gain a softer, more conciliatory touch. Its use a device to distance the user from association with feminism. And this I find interesting because I'm in gender studies, as some of you know, and I felt it that there is a real conflict between gender and feminism, So however much we keep on saying that gender is located in a set of power relations, it's relational, and so on and so forth, there is a conflict between these two. And when gender is used by agencies to talk about women, as it generally is, the women who come into view are those who are predominantly victim of a universalist patriarchy, but who can also, like I said, become agents with a little push. While feminist theory and practice over the last 3 decades and more has systematically critiqued, re-envisioned, and reconstructed, the category of gender, that it has been, the way it has been reconstructed and emerges as contingent through these debates, little of that dynamic also, not just from feminism, the debates around race, class, imperialism, the entire subaltern studies trajectory and the scholarship that emerged out of it, and the structural inequalities, all of these seem to vanish from the field of gender and development. Many of the prescription and practices associated with gender and development, a paper which I also have taught once in a while, continue to be underpinned with universalist assumptions about women, men, and gender relations. Now I'm almost pretty much coming to the end of what I said. I'll end with what might be the implications for academic feminism, because naturally, since I am situated here, thinking of the implications for academic feminism and for a gender studies or women's studies program. So it is an impossible no-win situation. And every day I'm thinking of finding a solution, but I'm not able to find. So it is tasked, this program, this domain is tasked on the one hand to teach feminist thought and methodology, and on the other hand to ensure a goal-oriented, job-centered approach. I'm not choosing one over the other or asking you to, so this is bad, this is good. But how do we straddle both? That is a question that one has to think about a little more deeply, taking a little more time, rather than just jumping to the more developmental discourse. Because let us not forget that there has been a historical tension between gender and development, much as we bring them together while teaching a course. So as Robin Wiegman points out, alongside the university's own reconfiguration as a consumerist entity in which many of the pedagogical emphasis of early women's studies about a connection with community and grassroots and so on, and grassroots is used every now and then in several neoliberal discourses. But these have been disarticulated from feminist politics and remobilized in the development discourse of development. A little bit of history that I want to sort of bring in the very end. In India, right from its inception in the 80s, and women's studies emerged as a discipline, interdiscipline if you like, in the 80s, has been tied to two contrary impulses. So, I'm a little anxious that, it shouldn't emerge in the end as if I'm looking back at the unsullied origins of women's studies and saying now we have kind of deviated and we must go back. There is no going back, But it is useful to look at this history, to think about the present. As some of my favorite subaltern studies authors would say, history is presentist in that sense. So the discipline of women's studies has always been tied to two contrary, in that very originary moment, has been tied to two contrary impulses. One, the ties to the women's movement. It emerges out of the women's movement as a critical perspective that must permeate the university. And on the other, its perception as a safe governmental discourse, welfareist if you like. The women's feminist movement here and everywhere else has been, on the other hand, another history, a project of retrieval of subjugated knowledges and recasting women. I recall two groundbreaking works here. Again, when I was doing my own research, and which helped me to think about how I might frame my discourse, my research. So these two works are Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Vaid's Recasting Women, published in 1989, and Suji Tharu and K. Lalita's Women Writing in India, 1991. This was an exciting moment for me because I was embarking on my MPhil and then on my PhD, and I had to unthink many of my own ideas. And also, I was allowed to retrieve some of what I thought does not qualify as academic knowledge. But they did not just come back as, personal experience. There is a lot of mediation in between. The new knowledges, these subjugated knowledges, these radical knowledges mediate what I thought was personal and give it a voice. Now, recasting women untethers women from colonial and nationalist formulations of a glorious past, glorious women, and so on, and explores how an ideal upper caste womanhood is constituted in the 19th century by very consciously, as a project, separating it from the concerns, crafts, skills, and performances of lower caste women, also lower caste men. You know, the writing of women that appears in women writing in India is, and because at that point of time I was in literature and was only taught canonical literature so far. You know, so Shakespeare, Milton, Pope, and one Virginia Woolf here and one Jane Austen there, but because they fitted or they sort of fulfilled the masculine canon. Virginia Woolf, I will read or I read through other channels. You know, it was a rereading for me. So the writing that appeared in Women Writing in India in 1991, when it was published, was not to add to the history of writing in India. That here there has been only masculine writing or men's writing. Now let us add women's writing, because there has been women's writing in India after all. So it was not in that spirit. It was to bring out the challenge it posed to canonical, masculinized, and often Eurocentric domains of literature and knowledge. And in the end, like I said, this is a search for me, and I'm not saying that one should reach a quick solution, but I do feel that women's studies must retain its searching, subversive charge in the face of now the near continuous threat, as well as, and this is worse, the rewards of containment. That is, if you produce some work in the name of the universal woman, who is also a victim, but who needs a little bit of push, then there are rewards from the state, from funding agencies, and so on and so forth. I have drawn synoptically and with many, many gaps, like I've acknowledged, how political histories of gender have contested mainstream dominant versions of knowledge. I do believe in one thing, that a theory of feminist knowledge remains important today, even in the face of dismissal and devaluation. And